I'm Susan Sheridan Tucker, Executive Director of League of Women Voters Minnesota. Today, I'm joined by members of Restore the Vote Coalition, one of the many coalitions the League participates with regard to voting protection. Knowing firsthand what it's like to be disenfranchised from our democratic system, the League of Women Voters emerged from the women's suffrage movement 95 years ago with the mission to educate voters on the issues, reform public policy, and to advocate for the protection, expansion, and restoration of voting for all citizens. Today, we'll focus on some current legislation that, if passed, will restore the voting rights of tens of thousands of Minnesotans. I'd like to introduce our guests. Mark Haase, Restore the Vote Coordinator, Council on Crime and Justice, and Minnesota Second Chance Coalition. Ben Swigert, Assistant Hennepin County Attorney, and Gina Evans, a disenfranchised voter. So I'd like to start with Mark. Can you help us describe the current legislation and why this is an important piece of legislation for us to be concerned about?
Sure. Thanks, Susan. So today there's about 47,000 Minnesota citizens who live in our communities, are participating in our communities, their children are in our schools, but they can't vote. And that's because they've been convicted of a felony. In Minnesota, like almost all states, once you've been convicted of a felony, your right to vote is taken away. But unlike in some states, actually there's 13 states where people can vote as soon as they leave prison or jail. In Minnesota, people can't vote once they're convicted of a felony until they've completed their entire probation or parole sentence. And here in Minnesota, that's a very large population. And it's the belief of the coalition that it's a good public policy idea to allow them to vote when they're living in the community.
Can you describe a little bit more specifically about the types of citizens that are being disenfranchised? Who makes up this group of 47,000?
Sure. Well, they live all over the state. When you look at state court data, the felony convictions occur all over the state, and about 64% of them are outside of Hennepin and Ramsey counties, and 36% are in Hennepin and Ramsey County. And the demographics are, I think it's about 62% white, and the remaining various communities of color.
Okay. And what you mentioned other states.
Sure.
To talk more a little bit, or to say a little bit more about what other states have done and why Minnesota is different.
Sure, yep. There are actually 20 states in total that have less restrictive policies than Minnesota. Two that never take away the right to vote, so people can vote from jail or prison. Those are Maine and Vermont. And then there's 13 states that allow people to vote, just like we're proposing, as soon as they leave jail or prison after they've been convicted of a felony. There's 5 that just allow people to vote, or allow people to vote when they're on probation, but not parole after prison, just kind of a mixed system. And then Minnesota shares its policy with about 20 other states. And then there's a number of states that have even more restrictive policies than Minnesota, or even after the sentence is completed, somebody has to go through some type of process. In some states, essentially, they lose their right to vote for their entire life.
Okay. And Ben, perhaps you can speak to, we're talking about felons, people who have served some time in prison. I suspect that there's some fear of this. Can you talk more about what a felon is, and really from the history of from the inception of Minnesota, how a felony was defined in our Constitution and where it is today?
Sure. Well, so the Constitution of the state of Minnesota says that you lose your right to vote when you're convicted of a felony. And then it gives to the legislature the power to decide when those folks get their right to vote back. And the legislature decided a long time ago that the people convicted of felonies should get the right to vote back after they finish their sentence. So what is a felony? A felony, for as long as there's been English legal thought, is any crime that the maximum sentence is a year and a day or more. Now, at the time so a lot has changed, though, in regard to what is a felony, and also in regard to voting rights since the Constitution was enacted. And a lot of those changes relate to why we think it's time for this policy to change. So first, at the time that the Constitution was enacted, there were only 30 some odd, I think, crimes that were categorized as felonies. There also, though, was no system of probation or parole or supervised release or anything like that, right? So if you were convicted of one of these crimes, you were going to prison. But we've made changes since then. So there are a lot more crimes now that are considered felonies, but then there's also a lot more ways that we deal with felonies. So many people, I think even most people who are convicted of felonies, don't ever go to prison. Many people go directly to probation, and then they spend some time on probation in the community. And then, of course, we've set up our system of good time or parole where if you're sentenced to prison time, the last third of your sentence is actually served in the community, not in prison. So these are all ways that we've come to recognize that our corrections system is not just about punishment, but it's also about rehabilitation and reintegration of people into the community. And we've also developed over this time a lot of alternative dispositions of cases where the adjudication of your case can be stayed, or the imposition of your sentence can be stayed, or the execution of your sentence can be stayed. So these are all sort of technical things, but they're all ways in which our correction system in the last 150 years has gotten a lot more nuanced in the way that we deal with cases. Now, why does all this matter? Well, it's because when the legislature decided that you shouldn't get your right to vote back until you finish your sentence meant time in prison. Now your sentence is most likely going to be mostly time spent in the community. And that's a really significant difference because, of course, the whole point of probation and parole is that people are living in the community. People are participating in positive ways in the life of the community. And certainly our perspective as people who work, I'm a prosecutor, I work in the Hennepin County Attorney's Office, and I work on this issue with the Minnesota County Attorneys Association. Our perspective is that it is inconsistent with the goals of our probation and parole system to have people not able to vote in the community, that actually voting is the kind of pro-social behavior that we actually would want people who are on probation and parole to be doing.
And is it fair to say that given the increase in the number of items that have been classified as felony conviction or prosecutable incidences, that we're seeing quite a bit of racial disparity in the types of individuals that are convicted of crimes? And that's part of what this legislation is trying to address, is that a larger percentage of the racial community is being disenfranchised because they continue to be on parole.
Yeah, I think it is well documented that that although most of the people that would be reenfranchised by this are white, this category of people, the 47,000 who would be reenfranchised by this, are disproportionately people of color. There are more that those communities are represented at larger numbers in this population than in the state as a whole.
Okay, and so we hear the term on paper and off paper. Could you just clarify that for us?
On paper just means that you're on supervised release of some kind, probation or parole. And when you're off paper, that means that you've completed your entire sentence, including any term of probation or parole, and then your right to vote is restored at that point under current law.
And do we have a good system in notifying people that they're off paper?
We do not have a good system for that. Many people are on probation for a long time, and the ability of the state and law enforcement agencies to know even where to notify certain people at the end of their probation is not always good. And there's no coherent statewide system for providing notice of someone's reenfranchisement at the end of their probation term. So people, so we know that there are people in the state, elected officials, many of them meet them door knocking. Certainly I have met them as I've been out in the community, who actually can vote and are unaware of that fact because their term of probation, for example, ended and no one told them at that point, well, okay, now you can vote.
Okay. So Mark, let's talk a little bit more about the work of the coalition. We have 60 organizations right now that are part of it. And tell us a little bit more about how that came to be and how this coalition has actually been growing over the last couple of years or more.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's a remarkable coalition. As I described some of the members, you'll see. The Second Chance Coalition has had this reenfranchisement issue on its agenda for a few years now, and I think it's about a couple of years ago that we were asked by some voting, more civic engagement type groups like the League of Women Voters to join with them and talk about how we might be able to collaborate on this. And so those, this kind of civic engagement groups and the Second Chance groups that work to reintegrate people into the community came together. And then from there, it's just kind of grown and grown and grown. So now that we have public safety and legal type organizations, the Minnesota County Attorneys Association and the Minnesota Corrections Association are members. Advocacy organizations like the Second Chance Coalition and the Council on Crime and Justice. Direct service organizations like Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge. We have a great representation from the faith community. The Minnesota Catholic Conference is a member, as well as the Joint Religious Legislative Coalition and Isaiah. So really, through at least the greater the Joint Religious Legislative Coalition, we even have Muslim representation there. So there's really Jewish Community Action is also a member. So really broad faith backing. Recently, we had a couple of more, I guess, what you'd call political organizations join as well. The Liberty Minnesota Libertarian Group and the Republican Liberty Caucus officially signed on as part of the coalition. So you can see an amazing amount of diversity there.
Right. So it's quite a broad coalition, which you don't always see.
Right.
Which is exciting. And I know that we're always excited to have a broad tent, everybody under the tent. Can you speak a little bit more about the current bills? What specifically they're going to address and where they are in the House and Senate and kind of the path that we're following at this point.
Yep. Well, as I stated initially, the bills allow people, would re-enfranchise people as soon as they leave prison or jail. The bill in the House has been introduced by Representative Tony Cornish. He's also the chair of the Public Safety Committee, Republican. That is House File 342, if anybody wants to follow it on the legislative website. On that bill, I think we have 12 Republican authors and about 14 DFL authors. And then in the Senate, Senator Bobby Joe Champion has introduced a bill, Senate File 355. And that there's two what we call, one of the bills in the Senate is a clone, because there's a limit on how many signatures you can have.
Right.
So we have a total of 10 co-authors, and 7 of those are Republicans and 3 are DFL members. So they've been introduced, as I said, and we hope, it sounds like we're going to have our first hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee within the next couple of weeks. So we do expect this to move this session. We have, with the bipartisan support and the support of committee chairs, we're very hopeful about its prospects.
So why should the average voter care about this bill?
Well, as you can kind of hear from some of the things you've heard here in the coalition, there's a number of reasons somebody might want to support this from their own perspective. One is if you want to live in a safe community. There is absolutely no public safety benefit that can be shown from disenfranchising people living in the community. Really the argument, one argument against it is it's just part of the punishment, but it's just punishment for punishment's sake. It doesn't have a rehabilitative or purpose. And there is some research that shows that when people engage in positive activities or engage in their community, they're less likely to recidivate. So the public safety groups come to this, from that perspective, at least partly, that it's good for public safety. If you're a person of faith and you believe in redemption and welcoming people back into the community and that restoration piece, this makes sense from that perspective as well. The libertarian perspective is that we should only prohibit people from doing especially things that relate to fundamental liberties like voting, if we absolutely have to. And those groups look at this and they say there's no reason that we shouldn't allow people living in the community to vote, so let's not take away that fundamental liberty.
So what are the absolute criticisms then? What's the counterpoint?
Yeah, really the only one that I've heard that is tenable, in my opinion, is that it's just part of the punishment, and if they're still on their sentence, they should continue to be punished in this way. But our response is that it's punishment without a purpose. Not exactly like being a parent, but I'm a parent, and I wouldn't punish my kids unless it had a purpose and was going to have some good effect. And really, this is just it's more it's punitive. But people say it's just part of the sentence, so people should have to undergo this punishment as well. Part of that also is that they'll say, well, if we take away, people are just going on probation, and we give them the right to vote, they're not being punished at all. But if you talk to somebody who has been convicted of a felony and hear their stories about not being able to get housing or employment, all the things they have to do as part of probation, they certainly are being punished, in my opinion, sufficiently outside of the voting rights being taken away. Which
is a great segue because we have Gina with us today. And one of the more powerful aspects of being part of this coalition is to be witness to many of the testimonies of individuals who have been directly impacted by this disenfranchisement. So Gina, why don't you tell us your story?
Thank you. Well, I grew up in a family that was torn apart by drugs and alcohol, and learned very early on that drugs and alcohol was a way to escape from what was going on at home. And I started using drugs really heavy by the time I was 15 years old. Ended up committing my first felony crime at 16, through treatment at 17. As an adult, I committed my first felony crime at 19. Was put on probation, and because of my inability to conform to the rules and regulations of probation, ended up having to serve my sentence out at Shakopee Women's Prison. I had a pretty hard battle with methamphetamines from the time I was 15 until I was 30 years old. I wasn't off of probation from the time I was 16 until I was 32 or 33 years old. Part of that, I have 12 felony convictions. I've been to Shakopee Women's Prison on 3 separate occasions for from drug possession to check forgery to theft and all of the stuff that that is involved with being having a career of drugs and crime. When I got out of prison the last time, I ended up entering into Minnesota Adult and Teen Challenge, where I spent a year healing, recovering, finding out that there was something bigger than myself that I needed to get in line and that I was empowered to make different decisions. So at that point, I wanted to get a job at Teen Challenge and learned that that I didn't even have the right to vote. As a felon, I don't know that they explained to you, now you don't get to vote. Like I didn't even really know. And I know there's other people that I work with that almost got in trouble for going down and registering to vote because nobody told them, now you don't get to vote. And so once I found out that that I didn't have the right to vote, I still tried to get engaged with the government a little bit through some bills and laws that were affecting me personally. So in 2004 was when I got out of treatment. And then for 2 years, I wasn't able to participate in voting and government. And then in 2006, I bought a home. In 2007, I got married. I had a full-time job all of that time. So I was paying property taxes. I was paying taxes. My children were living with me, and we were involved in a school district that made a decision to go to 4-day weeks. And for my child, that was not a good thing. And not only did I not get a voice in the referendum, but I didn't get a voice in who to vote for that was going to agree with me on which direction that was going to go. And that kind of, you don't think about that kind of stuff when you're involved in that kind of lifestyle, but being clean and sober, it felt like I was being punished for something that, and I can tell you another thing. I know they talked about like that the process about about notifying people that their rights are reinstated isn't perfect, but I was one of those people that got a letter that said your right to vote has been restored, and that was a huge, huge milestone for me. When I got that letter, it was like, I'm a real girl now, you know, I can vote. It was like the one last thing that kept me from being part of the society that I was expected to participate in. And I know, you know, I work at Teen Challenge now, and we work with, because we are such a long-term treatment program, we get a lot of dispositional cases that come to Teen Challenge where, you know, they're low-level, nonviolent drug offenders, and sometimes they get 20, 30, and even sometimes 40 years of probation. And granted, they're not in prison, and that's great for them, but that's 40 years of living in the community where they don't have a voice in the things that are going on around them, and it's not fair. And I feel like just knowing how it felt for me to get those rights back, I feel like when they talk about pro-social activity and how important that is, I can't speak to that enough. It was a huge thing for me to get that right back.
Well, thank you for sharing your story, because it takes courage to come out in public on an issue like this, and I think it's really helping people understand the value of what a vote really means to individuals. So thank you for that.
Yeah, if I could leave just one word for people, it would be this, that it's the right thing to do. For people, it just says the right thing to do.
And so that's a good place to ask for a call to action. League members always leave any event or program with a call to action. And so, Mark, what would you suggest in terms of our call to action today for the
Sure.
viewers?
Well, if people just want to look at this information some more, find out more about the issue and the groups involved, they can go to our website, which is restorethevotemn.org, restorethevotemn.org. And if they sign up there to get alerts, then they will get alerts about the legislation as it moves forward. When would be the best time to call their legislators or contact their legislators and ask them to support this. And we promise not to send advertising with that. It's just coalition activities. And people can feel free to just call their legislators directly now. Again, it's House File 342 and Senate File 355. The legislature has a great website to look up the authors and how to contact your own legislator. There's a link there to, I think it's called Who's My Legislator?
Mm-hmm.
And call them today and look, and might want to look at or ask their assistant if they're already on the bill, because a number are, and thank them because they need to hear that positive support
Absolutely.
from constituents. And if they're not signed on already, ask them to sign their name to it or vote for it when it comes up for a vote.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
So today we wanted to introduce you to the Restore the Vote movement and our coalition, and to tell you a little bit more about the legislation that's coming due. So we have a call to action. Call your legislators. They love hearing from you, whether you write a letter or a phone call, but they really do appreciate hearing from you. So I appreciate Mark and Ben and Gina sharing time with us today, and thank you.